our members generally take a more pragmatic approach to utilizing newer technologies. We are in dangerous industrial environments with hazardous materials, flammable materials, etc. So anytime you integrate a new tool into your toolbox, you have to have a great safety case.
You're listening to the Drone Radio Show podcast, the show about drones and the people who use them for business, fun, and research. Hosted by Randy Goers.
Hello, everyone. This is Randy Goers, and welcome to the Drone Radio Show podcast, episode 174. How does the petroleum industry use drones? For that question, we turn to Suzanne Lemieux, manager within the Midstream and Industry Operations unit of the American Petroleum Institute. Suzanne works with API staff and association members to advance policies and practices that enhance the safety of oil and natural gas operations and personnel. Her primary areas of responsibility are emergency preparedness and response, security, rail, natural gas, and maritime policy, energy infrastructure advocacy, and stakeholder engagement. She is also API's UAS lead and works with more than 625 members and external stakeholders in formulating UAS policy. In this edition of the Drone Radio Show, Suzanne talks about the American Petroleum Institute, the organization's top UAS priorities, and the need for safety first in deploying new technologies like UAS systems. Interdrone 2018 is the largest commercial UAV and drone conference with nearly 3,500 attendees, 120 sessions, and more than 175 exhibitors. The show will be held in Las Vegas on September 5th through 7th. Make your plans now to attend, use the code PARTNER, and receive $100 off the purchase price of admission. And before we hear from Suzanne, I want to thank those of you who have been supporting my funding campaign on Patreon. For as little as $1 per month, you can help defray the cost of production and keep the podcast going and growing. Go to patreon.com/drone radio show to join the team. So let's learn what the American Petroleum Institute thinks of drones with Suzanne Lemieux. Let's pick up the interview where I asked Suzanne to introduce herself.
My name is Suzanne Lemieux. I'm a manager in the Midstream group at the American Petroleum Institute. We're a national trade association representing all facets of the oil and natural gas industry. We have over 625 members that span from exploration and production to transportation and refining all the way down to delivery to the service station. So again, we represent all facets of the oil and natural gas industry.
Suzanne, what is API's involvement in regard to drones?
So back in 2016, we were advocating for certain provisions within the FAA reauthorization related to critical infrastructure, both to use drones and then to have some restrictions over critical infrastructure for the use of drones or UAS, whichever you want to call. So we realized at that point that we really needed better guidance from our membership. Aviation isn't typically something we've really worked on with our members. It's, some of the companies have their own aviation units. They own helicopters, fixed-wing aircraft, etc. But this was really a new space and obviously a significantly growing commercial space. So as we started to look at the different applications for drones within the industry, the regulatory environment, the legislative environment, we decided to form a working group from across our membership. So our UAS policy working group is what we call it, really pulled from different disciplines across our membership, from people from traditional aviation units to emergency response professionals to people who do inspections at refineries or terminals to people working in the offshore environment who want to potentially use these systems, and then some people from our security committee as well, because while we want to be able to use these systems, we want to use them safely. We also want to make sure that security is a consideration as the legislation and regulations move forward, and that the concerns of our members are represented as we go out and do our advocacy around these issues. So working with the FAA, working with Congress as they look at FAA reauthorization, some of these things that DHS is involved in, so much activity happening, the UAS safety team, et cetera. The IPP pilot program is something we're not on a team, but we were on teams that were submitted their applications to that process. So again, there's a tremendous amount of application across the oil and gas industry. A lot of it has to do with inspections. Some of it has to do with air monitoring. Some of it has to do with emergency response. We've already seen that in Harvey, the response to Hurricane Harvey, where companies were using drones to fly over facilities that they wouldn't have been able to reach otherwise due to flooding. So there's just a tremendous amount of interest from our members in how they can use these systems and what's allowed legally right now.
What did your members identify as the top priorities that they wanted to focus on?
I would say a couple of the top priorities are beyond visual line of sight. Certainly, if you want to do a pipeline right-of-way inspection, pipelines can go anywhere from a mile to a few hundred miles. So beyond visual line of sight is certainly something that would be advantageous as we work on sensor technology and what we can detect from these systems. And related to that has become an issue is remote ID and tracking, because if you want to create a safe space in the airspace, that's the next key to get there, and we're not going to get to beyond visual line of sight without that. Another one is the importance of FAA's federal preemption of potentially state or local regulations. Again, our companies are operating long-distance pipelines, large facilities that may span counties. They're operating in different states all over the country. They want to be able to have one program within their companies and not a piecemeal approach to regulation at the state or local level. So that's something that we've been working on with a coalition of other interested parties over the last year or two as certain pieces of legislation have popped up.
How widespread is the use of drones by your members?
So that's a varied answer. So some companies, some of the larger, as you can imagine, the larger integrated super majors have more advanced programs. Again, they have traditional aviation units, so adding this in to their repertoire is not that difficult. You have other smaller operators who don't have that experience, aren't as familiar with these systems, don't have pilots on staff, and they're working on what might be the best way to develop a program within their own companies. And then you have some companies who are really waiting to see a good model for a program come out. So it kind of runs the gamut right now, as our members do, from large integrated companies like ExxonMobil or Shell. Shell has several videos out on their website, as does BP. Chevron's got a pretty sophisticated program for drones. While other smaller pipeline operators or single refiners probably don't have that level of sophistication.
For the key priorities that you mentioned, do you feel that they are in line with what other industry sectors are advocating?
The commercial drone industry, I would say, probably we're not as aligned with, because they are about expanding as quickly as possible the use of these systems. Our members generally take a more pragmatic approach to utilizing newer technologies. We are in dangerous industrial environments with hazardous materials, flammable materials, etc. So anytime you integrate a new tool into your toolbox, you have to have a great safety case. So we're a little bit more pragmatic than the approach of, not that the commercial drone industry isn't looking at safety, but we just view it a little bit different. This is going to be one tool in our toolbox. It's not always the right tool based on weather conditions, availability, etc. A lot of different factors that go into that. If you look at other user, because we're more of a user industry, so from a user perspective, I think certainly with the electric utilities, some of those other large operators of critical infrastructure, we are pretty well aligned.
Are there regulations that are being discussed that affect those priorities?
So there are a couple of things in play right now. As most people realize, moving legislation through Congress is a bit of a difficult scenario in the current environment. So we're waiting for some things to come out of Congress that might affect some other regulations. We are definitely looking forward to the mode ID and tracking proposed rulemaking that FAA has promised. That should hopefully come out this year, but I know there are some other factors that are affecting that. We see that as one of the issues that has to be done first before you can get to UTM, unmanned traffic management, before you can get to beyond visual line of sight, or some of these other necessary pieces that will allow integration into the airspace. That's certainly a concern that we're focused on. But again, because it's tied up in some of the politics that are happening in D.C., it's a bit of a logjam.
Does the current pace of progress fit in with the industry's cautious approach? Or are members impatient waiting for the regulations to change?
I think there's a degree of impatience, but if you talk to the FAA, they agree that it's at the pace of technology that is so fast. It takes 3 years or more for a rulemaking, which is their typical speed. That's not really fast enough for anybody. So certainly we want to make sure that as we integrate these systems into our operations, we understand, any potential risks. Having lessons learned is always an important factor when you bring these systems in, knowing what potential failures have happened, how people recovered from those. All those things are things that we want to know about. I think the FAA, through the IPP, is trying to collect some of that data, trying to look at use cases, best practices, and certainly we're looking forward to information coming out. Some of our members are engaged in a couple of those pilot programs, so I think we'll be able to share some of that, at least within our working group, when that information comes to fruition at the end of the pilot program, and hopefully that informs any regulations. API, we're also a standard-setting organization for the oil and natural gas industry, and so there is a lot of questions about whether we will start to produce standards about how these systems are used in the industry. We're not at that point yet, again, because of where regulations are and limitations in some of these uses, and just the fact that it's all new, and we really need to have a good history of how these systems can be used and what can be done safely before we start looking at a potential standard.
Is API plugged into the flow of information from the pilot projects?
Not as yet, because those programs are still getting off the ground. They're still getting their approvals and going through the paperwork with FAA. So that hasn't been established yet formally within API. We were on a couple of teams that didn't win, but are still working through they're still working with FAA through whether it's their congressmen or their governors to get the approvals they need to do projects that aren't formally part of the IPP. So we may still be engaged as API in the sharing of that information with our members, and if our members want to participate, that's something we can facilitate. And that's always the role that we had said we would play in the teams, is just facilitating that outreach to our members who may want to participate. There's a couple of programs that are looking at emergency response, on water demonstrations, et cetera, and all those things can apply in the oil and gas industry as well.
Has API done any studies or assessments as to the long-term benefit of using drones?
We haven't done an analysis of that. What we have done so far, and again, this is a somewhat new area for API to be operating in, what we have done so far is create a benchmarking document to say, here's different uses that are currently happening in the industry. Here's where the regulations are, both in the U.S. and some of the other countries where we see some regulations coming out. And then some of the considerations, whether it's, security, cybersecurity, data management, et cetera. So it creates a landscape document, is what we call, just so every member can see what the level playing field is right now. As I said, some of our members are very advanced, some not as much. And so this was a way to get everyone, on the same page. But we haven't done an assessment of the potential value. Again, it's if you can take a man in an offshore platform, for instance, you put a person in a harness, you lower them over the side, and they do an inspection. Obviously, there's safety risk there. If you can use a drone to fly down and do that inspection, you've taken that risk to that person out of the equation. But then if it's windy, you might not be able to use a drone, and you might have to put the person. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of regulations about the safety of how you do this that I'm kind of glossing over. But again, it certainly can be a benefit, but it might not always be the right option. So doing an assessment of cost benefit would be a little bit difficult, I think.
Now, you're going to be speaking at Interdrone in September. What will your session be about?
So I am actually participating in 2 sessions. I'll be moderating the Women in Drones luncheon panel. So that should be an interesting gathering. Women are probably, I would say, underrepresented in the drone industry from the experiences that I've had. Women are underrepresented in the oil and gas industry too, so that's nothing new for me. So that should be an interesting conversation to hear about what women are doing and how they're tackling an industry that is very largely male-dominated. The panel that I'm on is to talk about uses of drones in inspections. So certainly, as I said, offshore platform inspections, flare stack inspections at refineries, pipeline inspections, even tank inspections, inside tanks when you're, taking product out. A lot of times they need to be cleaned. You want to inspect them when you do that. And so flying a drone inside a tank is an easy way to do an inspection without having to bring in a lot of equipment and people and climbing up in there. So there's a lot of different ways. There's just a couple very high-level examples of how we're starting to use drones to do inspections, and there's more we'll do as the technology develops. A lot of that technology is related to sensors, but that'll be an interesting panel as well. I think it's myself and a couple of folks from different industries, so we'll get a perspective on how inspections are changing with these systems.
Are you going to provide some case studies or examples of how drones are used, or will it be more technical in nature?
I'll probably do more of the case study idea of how these systems can be used in different environments. Certainly, as I mentioned before, in Harvey, that was a really great example of how drones can be used to do inspections. At the Shell facility down in, I believe it was Deer Park, they had flooding. It would have taken, if they had waited for the flooding to recede and put in men on ladders, it would have taken 2 weeks. They used drones. It took 4 hours. So there are a lot of different examples of where these systems are used in different operating environments. Again, in a refinery, it's different. Inside a tank, it's different. So I'll probably go into some of those examples in a little bit of detail.
What are you hoping to learn from the Women in Drones luncheon?
I think from a learning perspective, I'd like to hear how women are finding their experiences within the drone industry. Is it open to women? Is it something that they've been able to use different management techniques to work their way in? Certainly, I know some people who are former Air Force pilots and they've gotten in through that way. Again, a lot of this is based in Silicon Valley, these companies, which is also not the friendliest environment for women. So what are the lessons they've learned to succeed in a challenging environment?
Obviously, drones aren't the only thing that you're engaged in at API. What other projects or programs are you responsible for?
Sure. So personally, I have several other issues aside from drones. I work maritime issues. We move a tremendous amount of oil and gas via water, whether ocean-going, very large crude carriers or inland barges. I also have physical security, and that's across all parts of the industry. So that's something I've been engaged in for some time. And I also have the lead for emergency response and crisis management within API. So hurricanes, as you saw with Harvey, can certainly affect our industry quite a great deal. Also flooding, ice storms, et cetera. And so we respond, we work with our members and work with our government partners to help them understand how the industry prepares and responds for those types of events.
How does the drone industry compare with the other programs that you're involved with on a day-to-day basis?
I think it's really interesting because it is so new and it is growing so fast. There's always something different to learn. The shipping industry certainly, and the oil and gas industry in general, has done a great deal in the last, I would say, 30 years to use technology to really develop efficiencies within the industry and to produce more effectively with less environmental issues. We've become the largest producer of oil and gas in the world at this point. And so comparing an older industry that's really using technology to advance with a younger industry, and where are the places we've learned that we still see where the commercial drone industry has to learn. Again, it's that focus on safety. Goal of zero incidents is our industry's motto, that we're always working to zero incidents. And how can we take the safety culture we've built within our industry? I think it's in manned aviation. How do we make sure that that's baked into the drone industry as they continue to move forward with providing innovative services?
Yeah, I can see where that would be a challenge in itself, as there is a pent-up frustration to move quickly and boldly with innovation and regulation. But at the same time, industries like yours have to keep an eye on safety. Yeah,
it's a pretty significant concern. And I think that's why we see our members in different places, because it is a risk anytime you introduce something new, and especially if what you're already doing you're able to do safely. Is it worth the risk? Maybe you're taking a man out of the equation, but if you're introducing a piece of equipment that could potentially create a spark, which could lead to some kind of a incident, these are all factors that companies need to consider. I think also when we look at this space and the energy industry is a pretty significant target of cyber attacks. That's well documented, that these systems are certainly going to be part of that picture. And are they safe? And what is the level of cybersecurity that these companies are putting into their systems as they develop them? That's a big question for us. How much data is being exfiltrated? How well are you able to use the volumes of data that are collected? And is that really helpful in some of these systems? I think there's all kinds of questions that our members have that we're looking at as far as not just cybersecurity, but data security and then the value of that data. If you have 1 million images, but you don't know how to look at them or process them, is there value there? And then where are those images going, and how do you make sure they're controlled, and how do you make sure you're getting the best value out of that data? While it's definitely a challenge, don't you think there are a lot of opportunities for those who can address those issues? Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's a little concerning. I'm sure there are people working on it, but it's not the part that's really publicized the most. And even, I joined the UAST safety team when it formed, which is a subset to the Drone Advisory Council. And they are looking at aspects of safety, but they're not looking really too much at cybersecurity so far. And I would consider that part of the safety of the system. But I think maybe it's, again, a lot of those people are from either FAA or the commercial drone industry, and they're coming at it from a very different perspective than I am. Part of the reason I participate in that group is to make sure that, those questions are being raised. Okay, it's great you can do all these things, but how safe is it in the end? And that's more from the user's perspective than the, developer's perspective. And for my final question, Suzanne, what message would you like to leave listeners about the role of the American Petroleum Institute in the drone industry? That we see huge opportunities across all of the industry for using these systems in the right place at the right time with the right personnel and the right policies in place. There's a lot of questions that our members have about how vendors and different providers are operating safely, what experience they have. I think these are all conversations that we want to continue to have. There has been talk about how do you certify a vendor or a service provider. I think that in the long run will be an interesting question to sort through. Again, you could have 10, 15 years experience flying a drone and not have the formal training of someone in general aviation or someone who comes from the Air Force, but it doesn't necessarily make you less qualified. So how do we work through what that looks like and how we can really move forward with the best safety programs in place? That's it for episode 174 of the Drone Radio Show. I hope you enjoyed hearing from Suzanne Lemieux of the American Petroleum Institute. I want to thank Suzanne for taking the time to speak with me. If you want to learn more about the American Petroleum Institute or want to connect with Suzanne, check out the webpage at api.org. If you like the Drone Radio Show, please consider supporting the podcast with a small donation. The content is always free, but for as little as $1 per month, you can help defray the costs of production. To donate, go to patreon.com/Drone Radio Show. And thanks for listening. Your support means a lot to me, and I hope you'll listen to more episodes of the Drone Radio Show podcast to hear how others are using drones for business, fun, and research. For the Drone Radio Show, I'm Randy Goers.
This has been the Drone Radio Show podcast. More information on today's show can be found on our website at www.droneradioshow.com. If you're using drone technology for business, fun, or research and would like to share your experience on the show, please visit our website and fill out a guest appearance application. And don't forget to follow us on your favorite social media channels.